5 3 9 7 1 5.
Hello, friends. I'm your Vitamita Vegemin girl.
She's not.
Are you tired, run down, listless?
Yes.
Do you poop out at parties?
I
Are
don't
you
poop
unpopular? Pulling an upper decker at the party? This is a shout out to Matt Bush, who introduced me to the concept of the upper decker.
I don't know what that is.
There are some people that you just don't piss off. That's when you go to a party and before you leave, you go to the toilet and you poop in the tank.
What?
And then you leave.
That sounds like a Matt Bush thing to do. But
It is a Matt Bush thing to do.
Absolutely horrible.
Anyway.
And really gross.
Love you, Matt. But anyway.
Love you, Matt.
Now that I'm done with my Lucy Ricardo commercial, welcome once again to Bigfoot for Breakfast.
We're happy to see you. We've been expecting you.
We're always expecting you here at the home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we hang out in the studio every week, challenging conventional thought. I choked on my spit there.
I heard you. Cat got your tongue. Literally at your house, that could happen.
It could happen. If I passed out, my cat would eat me.
If I ever find that, I would do a podcast episode on it.
We are your hosts, Samantha Carter
and Sarah Jones.
We appreciate you so much for joining us once again, or joining us this week for the very first time to hear more of the things you never knew you wanted to know.
You had no idea.
If you haven't ever done so, please rate and review our show on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from. We appreciate that tremendously. It helps out the show and we love hearing from you guys.
Except, I have to tell you.
Oh.
So, last night, I always read through the reviews that we get on Apple Podcasts. I'm sure you do too. But last night, I found this website called Chartable, which I guess is really super well known, except to me. I didn't know. And apparently it takes all your reviews from all the platforms and puts them in one spot, which is super handy.
Yeah.
So then I found that and I was like, oh, I'm going to just spend 10 minutes and read through some of these. And I found one from December of 2019 that I had never seen. And it said it was from Apple Podcasts, but I never saw it on there. It said that our banter is cringy.
Are we cringy, guys?
It might be kind of a fair assessment.
At times.
Other people say they like our banter. It just depends on what you're into. Some people are really into us. Some people are not.
I'd rather be your shot of whiskey than everyone's cup of tea.
I'm not everybody's cup of tea. Sometimes I'm a cringy cup of tea, apparently.
There are some very shitty teas out there.
I think all tea is kind of shitty, actually. I'm not a tea person. Iced tea with a little bit of sugar in it.
You drink a lot of bit of sugar in your iced tea.
1 gallon of iced tea. 3/4 of a cup of sugar. That's not that bad. That's my recipe. So back up.
My tea has no sugar in it. And my daughter calls my hot tea my hot salad water. Enjoy your salad water, mother.
If your daughter brought me tea and called me mother, I think it would feel really Norman Bates.
Wasn't there a movie where there was some poison in a cup of tea too? Like rat poison?
I think he gave her that, but then he ended up smacking her with the shovel. Maybe he got impatient. She wasn't going out fast enough.
Maybe. I don't know.
Sometimes I get impatient, so I understand.
I know there's no rat poison in my house, and I'm not sure how she would acquire it, but I think she likes me enough.
I mean, so far so good.
She has a knife collection, and I haven't gotten stabbed yet, so... So, let's make an agreement that you will never wake me up in the middle of the night holding a knife.
Knives stay put away in the middle of the night while standing quietly by the bedside.
Should we move on?
Probably. I mean, one time we got a review that said we need to shut up and get on with the episode, so probably we should just take that into account.
And we did take that into account.
For a minute.
Our intro paragraphs were significantly shorter for a while. Now we're just off script.
All right, let's go on script.
Add us on Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat for updates and contest announcements. That's a tractor. We've got tractors, Southern Iowa.
I love how every time traffic goes by, you get that same look on your face that Austin Powers gets when he's looking at the Molly guy. Molly.
You know what's funny, though? Is that when I make that face, it's literally imitating your annoyed face.
Oh.
I can't accurately do it.
I'm going to have to improve my annoyed face significantly, apparently.
You do the bunny nose?
My nose twitches when I'm
Yes, you
annoyed?
do that. Like, it's not an actual annoyed face. It's like I'm over dramatically expressing that I am annoyed face. That's the one right there. If you really want to tell us how you feel, good or bad, you can leave us a voicemail or a text. You can text us.
That's true. We just found out.
The number is 641-812-2635. Leave your message or your text message and we'll play it or read it on the next episode.
So we just actually got a text. I put it on Facebook, but we need to say it on here. It said, best fucking podcast ever. Fuggin.
Take that, cringe guy. I hope you still listen, though. I hope you gave us a second chance, because I feel like we've improved since December, because we were literally only 2 months into podcasting and we were green.
We didn't know anything about audio.
And we've been told that we've improved by people who avidly listen.
So-
and there are people that avidly listen to us.
Yeah, that's crazy. We never thought anyone would listen, but
Her-
sometimes people do.
Her husband doesn't understand why anybody wants to listen to us have conversations.
He wants us to go away.
If you're not cool enough to talk to us and you want to text us, you coward. No, I'm just kidding. You're not a coward. We love hearing from you either way.
Speaking of cowards, let's begin this episode with an impactful quote. Cowards make the best torturers. They understand fear and they can use it. Mark Lawrence, Prince of Thorns. Check it out on Google Books, y'all. If you haven't guessed it already, the theme of today's episode is torture. Specifically, medieval torture devices. We will be posting photos to Facebook and Instagram and probably Twitter of some of the devices that we are going to discuss, so you can get a better visual. In case our vivid descriptions aren't graphic enough for you psychos. Just kidding again, kind of.
Also, we don't own the rights of any of those photos for future reference.
Yeah, so we'll be posting where they came from so that we don't get in trouble for copyright infringement.
So, what exactly are we addressing here? Well, according to thehistoryoftorture.com, torture is the deliberate infliction of physical and psychological pain with the purpose of obtaining information or extorting a confession from the victim and thus enabling a conviction. It can also be the penalty itself. The use of torture as a means to extract confessions, humiliate, and or punish is no small piece of world history. The use of torture reached an out-of-control high during the Inquisition against heresy, cases of witchcraft, and political crimes, as it had become the standard means by which confessions were extorted. There are documented records of trials throughout the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe which testify to the countless verdicts that had been doled out based solely on confessions that had been obtained by excruciating methods of torture. Many of those trials ended with capital punishment, but I'd like to also specify that many of those sessions of questioning whether the person was innocent or guilty also ended in death.
Dun, dun, dun. So why would someone be tortured during the Middle Ages? We can't really investigate the methods by which people were tortured without first dabbling in the why and by whom. We've already brought up that a significant amount of this occurred during religious inquisitions. Inquisitors went to extreme measures to extract confessions because they believed it was their duty to bring the accused back to the faith. It was for their own good. So it's fine, right?
It's fine.
It's fine. We're all fine. A true confession would result in the accused being forgiven, provided that they survived the torture. Even if they did, they were still forced to absolve themselves of their sins by performing penances, such as a pilgrimage or wearing multiple heavy crosses. Although mutilation during these inquisitions was technically forbidden, in 1256, Pope Alexander IV decreed that inquisitors could clear each other from any wrongdoings that they might have done during torture sessions. Forgive me, Father, for I too have sinned.
Bruh, it's cool. You did it for God, King, and country. You're saving souls. Like Velocipaster. It's
No,
fine.
It's not. It's not fine, and it's not like Velocipaster.
He killed sinners. Have you seen Velocipaster?
No, I don't want.
If you haven't seen Velocipaster, oh, you need to. I watched it twice. Feel like you deserve a medal.
Or a...
Lobotomy?
Yes, that's the word I was thinking of.
Really?
Yeah, that was literally what I was trying to come up with.
Sweet. Anyway, the inquisitorial system was actually based on ancient Roman law. The most famous or well-known of the many inquisitions which occurred between the 12th and 19th centuries, yes, they lasted that long, was the Spanish Inquisition. In this case, the word Inquisition refers to the Roman-based tribunal court system, which was utilized by both the Catholic Church and some Catholic monarchs to root out, suppress, and punish heretics. For those unfamiliar with the term, a heretic was a baptized member of the church who held opinions contrary to the Catholic faith, and pretty much anyone else who held beliefs that did not align with the Catholic faith and refused to denounce them, even after being corrected by the church, and even may have attempted to teach these beliefs to other people by their own free will, though, not under the influence of the devil, which would change things a little bit.
The Papal Inquisition officially began with Pope Gregory IX, who issued a decree in 1231 implementing the tribunal court system to try and punish the heretics. The Spanish Inquisition was officially established in 1478. The Jews were under attack and later banished. The Roman Inquisition was established during the 1540s and focused on the heretical crimes of witchcraft, sorcery, and blasphemy.
Sorcery.
One of the most famous cases was that of Galileo. Later in the 16th and 17th centuries, the astronomer Kepler, which we talked about in our...
Was it the Great Dying?
Yeah. He was also entangled in the witch hunting expedition, which I did not know. We will get into those stories a little later, but I don't want to get too far off topic. As much as I'd love to continue the educational lecture on the Inquisition, we may do another episode on that later. That's not what we're talking about today. But now you have a little context into the reason for the use of today's topic.
Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. The Smashing Pumpkins. Why is this quote relevant? Well, because our first instrument of torture that we're going to discuss is in fact a rat in a cage, desperate to get out of that cage by any means necessary, including digging his way out through your belly button. So this method of rat torture involves placing a rat inside a half cage placed on top of a restrained person's abdomen. The cage is slowly heated. With sharp claws and teeth, the rat quickly gnaws its way into the victim's bowels in an effort to escape the heat, which of course causes excruciating pain and terror for the person whose abdomen the rat is digging its way into. This old-school torture method also inspired Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in the 20th century to employ rat torture in this way. Also, around that time, the Argentines modified this method, and instead of placing the rats against the abdomen, they used a telescopic tube leading the rats inside of a prisoner's body through the rectum or vagina. How quaint. Should we sing the Lemmiwinks song now, or...
I don't know what the Lemmiwinks song is.
Oh my gosh. Some South Park. Watch some South Park.
I don't like South Park that much.
If it gets you any idea, since we're talking about rectums, Lemmiwinks was a hamster.
Oh, that seems relevant.
Because while rats are somewhat more aggressive and larger than a hamster, there are those who seem to have no problems with introducing rodents to their rectums. But that's a whole other story.
I work in an emergency room, and I can validate that claim. It doesn't always go well.
Can confirm.
Actually, I've never had that, but I have heard stories. The Tower of London had a room that was nicknamed the Rat's Dungeon. This room was a pitch black cell which sat underneath the waterline of the Thames River. As the river rose, rats swept up from the shores, floating into the room, and would nibble at the flesh of the prisoners in the dungeon. Swimming snacks.
Cereal? It's like cereal.
What? I guess.
Rat cereal. Anyway.
Your mind went weird there.
Cereal. I love cereal.
In other attempts at torture, prisoners were simply locked inside of a small confining space with rats, with no way to avoid them. The prisoners would slowly be driven mad as the rats gnawed at their limbs. The fear of rat torture could almost be more useful for torturers than the actual pain itself. It sounds like there are very few specific documented cases of rat torture actually being used, though. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus, because that is horrible.
The band Cannibal Corpse has a graphically lyric song about the next torture device, and I figured since we started this talk with rats digging through our intestines, it seems only fitting that we go ahead and discuss the slow removal of said intestines. Yes, the name of the song is Intestinal Crank. This method of torture involved the cutting of an almost certainly sterile,
of course,
incision in the abdominal area, separating the duodenum from the pylorus, which is the upper part of the intestine, was then pulled from the abdomen and attached to a crank. Think a long horizontal bar with a barb in the center. You stab the barb through the intestine to hold it in place, and then the crank attached to the bar would then be rotated to extract the intestines from the gastrointestinal cavity. Keep in mind that this person begins this torture completely conscious.
Yeah, I don't think if they're going to go to this extreme, they probably don't care about sedation.
They are watching and feeling every bit of this. The victim and those witnessing the torture would see anywhere between 9 to 18 feet collected around the shaft of the crank. This torture was of course classified as capital punishment, as it always ended in the death of a person being tortured, albeit a very slow one, slow enough to get whatever information was asked of this person. But no matter what information they gave, there was no saving the person from this. If you remember the 2000 movie The Cell starring Jennifer Lopez and Vince Vaughn, there was a scene in which Vince Vaughn's character was subjected to this method of torture. Someone in there called me a naughty worm. If you haven't seen it, you can look up the scene on YouTube by searching The Cell Intestine Crank. You're welcome.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
Embrace the pain, that is the only way. Truer words were never uttered as this quote from Enemos to Crixus on Spartacus, Blood and Sand. In trying to give some pop culture references so you guys can check out some videos and get a better idea of what we're talking about. This quote was spoken just before the flogging or whipping of Crixus. Flogging, flagellation, lashing, or whipping is the act of beating a human body with special implements such as whips, lashes, rods, switches, the cat o' nine tails, the knout, etc. Typically, flogging is imposed on an unwilling subject as a punishment. The strokes are usually aimed at the unclothed back of a person or other corporeal areas. In the Roman Empire, flagellation was often used as a prelude to crucifixion. In this context, it's sometimes referred to as a scourging. In England in 1530, the Whipping Act was passed, under which vagrants were taken into a nearby populated area, quote, and there tied to the end of a cart naked and beaten with whips throughout such market town until the body shall be bloody, end quote. This was the most common form of punishment, especially on ships. The captain would decide the amount of lashes that the victim could receive, 10 being the minimum, 50 causing severe pain, and 100 being potentially fatal. And the lashes were delivered using the cat o' nine tails. What's the cat o' nine tails?
I'm getting ready to tell you.
Okay, well that's what I need to know.
The cat of nine tails was a whip made of either hemp or leather and featured 9 long lashes, each with at least 3 blood knots tied in them, referred to as its tail. So of those 9 different lashes on this whip, they would tie a few knots. Some of them would have some knots, some of them would all be knotted, depending on, how big of an asshole the guy was. The 9 cords or tails represent the 9 lives of a cat, and the whip also left marks like the scratches of a cat, like a really big cat, like Tiger King style. Its origin is believed to date back to ancient Egypt, where the domestic cat was sacred, and even then was said to have 9 lives. The Egyptians believed that when beaten with cat hide, the victim gained virtue from the whip.
Random fun fact. Apparently in the Royal Navy, the cat o' nine tails was kept in a red bag tied high up to the mast, and the sailors were always afraid of someone, quote, letting the cat out of the bag, which is a fun origin story for the commonly used idiom, which I fact-checked. And according to a lot of different sources, which gave a lot of different origin stories for that phrase, it may or may not be true, but it sounds cool, so we're going to go with it.
Another whipping tool. Whipping tool.
I don't watch South Park, but I do watch Family Guy.
Another cool whipping toy, which was mentioned as a method of flogging torture, was the flail. Similar to a mace, which features a spiked ball on the end of a chain with a handle, the flail would perhaps not have the spikes.
It was just a metal ball.
Yeah. There's speculation on how realistic this tool actually would have been based on its unpractical design, so I'm not really sure that it was a thing.
Let's take this discussion a little further downward. Can it go further downward? Good God. To the feet. Foot whipping is a method of punishment that consisted of beating the soles of a person's bare feet. Unlike the other types of flogging, the intentions of this method was to cause pain rather than actual injury to the victim. Blows were generally delivered with a light rod, knotted cord, cane, or lash. The strokes were generally aimed at the arches of the feet and repeated over a certain number of times. If you've ever stepped on a Lego, you know that has to hurt.
While we're down here at the feet, Let's talk about the Spanish boot. There were many variations of this device, and they all resulted in the crushing and mutilation of a victim's leg or legs. Typically, this device consisted of two semicircular pieces of wood held together by some means varying from simple rope to iron straps. The leg was inserted between the two halves, which sometimes had iron protuberances inside. So they were spiky boots.
Spiky boots.
Ensuring a snug fit. Nice and cozy. Pressure was applied to the leg by means of the tightening of the screws or by hammering wedges of wood between the wood and the leg.
Oh my gosh.
A refusal to confess resulted in more pressure or more blows. This usually left the victim crippled, and the complete crushing of bones to the marrow was not unusual.
Man, people really probably were afraid to step out of line.
We don't question the church.
Another instrument of torture which applies its damage to the pedal area of the human anatomy is the instep borer. The instep borer was reportedly an instrument of torture that externally resembled an iron boot, or the Spanish boot. It was hinged to permit the free insertion and removal of the bare foot so they could open it and close it. A crank projected from the housing over the instep, which concealed a long, thick, serrated iron blade grooved so as to inflict maximum damage and promote liberal blood flow.
So think a saw blade.
Right. Lots and lots of blood. Turning the crank slowly advanced the blade into the boot, punching a hole through the center of the instep, causing a wound that was so large that it was likely a person would die of infection. I was unable to find many sources of information for this particular method of torture, which leads me to believe it is likely more myth than reality.
And actually, not necessarily a saw blade. I'm thinking like a screw.
Oh.
So it's like grooved and it digs in.
Now it digs up through the foot, like the middle of the foot?
Like, yeah, they put it and then they screw it down. So it'd be like a drill. Sounds like a lot of fun.
No, it does not.
The piquette sounds like it was a method of torture used mostly in the military and was a way to maintain discipline. It didn't require any sophisticated tools, as all that was needed was placing a stake in the ground and tying the victim's thumb far above his head. The stake was never sharp enough to draw blood, but it was meant to be very painful. Sometimes the victim's whole hand was tied instead of just the thumb to prevent major injuries. You still need those opposable thumbs in the army. When the victim felt that his thumb was about to dislocate, he would put his weight on the stake, which he was standing on the stake with either just his foot or toe or whatever of one foot. So imagine a stake, like Vlad the Impaler, like a stake, but it's blunted on the end. So it's just like a hard pressure point. And your hand or thumb of one arm is tied above your head so you can hold yourself up. But if you put pressure on your foot to relieve the pressure from your hand, you're getting your foot or toe dug into by the stake.
Oh.
So placing too much weight on the stake would lead to a lot of pain. Although this torture method was never meant to cause death or injury, it was known on occasion to last for up to 2 days, which did sometimes cause death. But most of the time, this torture method only lasted a few hours. A common result was a broken thumb, although most often than not, the victim experienced no permanent damage.
Don't talk back.
A torture boot was a high boot made of spongy leather that was placed on the victim's feet. The victim was tied near a fire by the boots.
He was restrained near a fire.
Next, boiling water was poured onto the boots, which seeped through the leather boots and dissolved the flesh of the victim's feet. In some cases, the torture administrators add wood inside of the boot and pour oil in as well. This action expands the wood and cuts off circulation to the foot. If they wanted to be more mean, they drilled screws through the boot and the foot as well.
We're slowly going to move upward in the human anatomy, and tragically, there are plenty of torture tools which were applied to areas below the belt. Let's start with one of the more mild ones, the pear of anguish. That sounds very mild, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
To make matters worse, it was also known as the vaginal pear or the rectal pear. So this little devil was a pear-shaped device with the body of the pear made up of 4 metal leaves joined by a hinge at its top and a key or a crank on one end.
I just want to make it clear too that this is pear as in P-E-A-R, like the fruit.
Yeah, so it's a little metal pear made of 4 little pieces that come together to form the pear.
And there's a hinge at the top so it can open and close.
So Imagine this little pear being inserted into your vagina, anus, or throat, depending on the nature of your crime that you had allegedly committed. If you were accused of heresy, you got it in your mouth. The anal and vaginal pears would be your tool of choice if you were accused of homosexuality or witchcraft, among other things. So, you're restrained, you have the speculum from hell stuck in one place or another, and you're being asked to confess or submit some other form of information to a likely aggressive fellow who enjoys his job. You don't give him the answer he wants, so he begins turning the key on the tip of the device, which opens the leaves a little bit at a time. He continues slowly as the leaves widen, causing excruciating pain and likely massive internal and external damage. This is the type of things that you have nightmares about before visiting your gynae or proctologist. Now, release the breath that you're holding as you cringe because, according to written accounts, if the pair saw any use at all, the few sources from the period that make any mention of it usually call it the choke pear, and it was less likely used as a device of torture as it actually doesn't seem to go officially on record until the 17th century. So most likely it was used against heretics and they would just put it in their mouths. Although it had been mentioned as being used from the other end.
So it might not have actually happened that often.
Yeah, that doesn't make it any less severe.
I feel really bad for those few people who that happened to.
So there's probably very few people that actually got it in the bum.
Unfortunately, there is far more documentation of the practical use of other such torture devices, including the Judas cradle, or the cradle of Judah, which was a tall, thin stool with a metal or wooden pyramid on top. The victim would be stripped and bound with ropes, suspended and lowered very slowly onto the device, at which point, no pun intended, get it? Point. The tip of the pyramid would then enter the vagina or the anus. Any movement by the victim would cause an increasing amount of pain. This tool was often used to acquire information. If the victim refused to talk, the torturer would then rock the victim, raise and drop them repeatedly onto the device. Move the legs, causing the tip of the pyramid to protrude in different ways. This method was actually considered a humane method of torture. The tip of the pyramid was often lubricated, so that's good.
No, to make it slip in farther, it's worse.
Okay, so
with olive oil.
On occasion, brass weights were hung from the victim's legs. The primary attraction for this torture method was the humiliation the victim would endure. If the victim fainted from the pain, the torturer could lift them until they were awake and then resume the torture. Torturers would sometimes need to continue interrogations overnight and would keep the victim suspended above the device to resume the torture in the morning. This device, it seems, was considered quite effective in causing sleep disturbance.
You don't say.
Tortures could range from several hours to several days. This device was named for the famous traitor, Judas, as it was used to get confessions from accused heretics. The sides of the pyramid would run with feces and blood. If the person subjected to this torture did not die from the wound themselves, they would definitely die of infection.
Not unsimilar from this device is the Spanish donkey. So imagine a sawhorse, a device which consisted of a main horizontal board cut with a wedge at the top, fastened to two cross beams. It's like a long pyramid shape. It's got a point at the top. And you're sitting on this. A naked victim was placed astride the main board or wedge as if riding on a donkey. So it's between your legs and you're straddling it. The torturer would place various numbers of weights on their feet. The agony could be fine-tuned by using lighter or heavier weights. To cause more pain, torturers could pull the person's ankles in different directions or burn the bottoms of their feet with hot ashes or fire. So as the weight was added, the person became more impaled. With constant pressure on the wedge, the victim would most often rupture their perineum and their sacrum would break. There have been a few reports of the victim being sliced completely in half due to too much weight being attached to their feet.
Oops.
Once again, if they did not die from the injury, they would likely die from infection. This was primarily designed for women, but some men would be subjected to this torture as well. Apparently, the use of this type of device carried on into the Civil War. A documentary on the History Channel called 80 Acres of Hell described a similar torture device called the mule, which Confederate prisoners were forced to ride until they passed out. Many were crippled for life, and this was considered quite entertaining to the Union generals, apparently. Add that to the list of things that I didn't know.
We're always learning here at Bigfoot for Breakfast. We're learning with you. While we're in the area, castration was also used as a method of torture, and that's all I've got to say about that, Jenny. So this is cringe-inspiring. Let's move on to a different area of anatomy, like the limbs. Let's talk about being drawn and quartered. This particularly sadistic form of execution was invented in 1241, specifically designed for the punishment of a man named William Maurice for the crime of piracy, but it became the method of choice for executing those accused and found guilty also of treason. Typically, they would be stripped with their arms bound out in front of them. The prisoners were hanged for a short period, either from a ladder or a cart. The cart would then be taken away, or a ladder, it would be turned, leaving the man suspended in midair with the intention of strangulation to the point of near death.
Only nearly dead.
Yeah, they're not all the way dead. It's just so they're close to dead. Although some victims were killed prematurely, the prisoner was then cut down and taken to be disemboweled, likely castrated and then quartered or chopped into 4 pieces, perhaps with a cutting tool like an axe, or ripped apart by horses going in different directions.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse indeed.
This happened to people alive, though.
Which brings us to the rack.
Yes, the rack.
Dun dun dun. This device was actually invented and used long before medieval times and was utilized during early medieval times, but became much more popular during the middle and high medieval times as the Inquisition raged on in full force. Now for the visual. Picture a rectangular frame lying horizontally and raised slightly off of the ground. So you're on a platform bed, but it's not mattressed.
It is not puffy and comfortable.
Wood was the most common material to construct this frame, but other materials could be used. On this frame, there was a roller at either one or both ends with a handle which was attached to the roller, and pulleys and levers were used to operate the roller. Pull the lever, Kronk! The torture would fasten the ankles of the victim to one roller and the wrists to the other. They then used the handle to increase the pressure on the attached chains. The roller could also be rotated on its axis using the pulleys and levers to strain the ropes or chains and stretch the joints of the victim.
So all 4 limbs here are tied to the 4 corners of this platform bed. There's a crank, and every time they turn the crank, it pulls all of your limbs in different directions.
The joints would eventually be dislocated and even separated, with the muscles torn apart. Here's a fun fact for someone that I know. Dad. The torture rack was one of the most common methods of torture used against the Knights Templar. The famous trials of the Knights Templar were conducted during the early 1300s, and some of them have been well documented, including the use of the rack. Other crimes that were seen fit for punishment by stretching were blasphemy, heresy, witchcraft, and other crimes against religion and morality. There really was no limit or no specific thing. They felt like torturing you, they were going to do it.
It seemed like they were just kind of like, what do you want to do today? How do you want to do this? And then they just
stretch a man.
They just picked their favorite one for the moment, whatever phase they were going through at that time. Another widely used torture device during the medieval times was the Catherine wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, since it was a device used to break the bones of the accused and crush them to death. The wheel consisted of a large wooden wagon wheel with several radial spokes. A person was fixed to the wheel, and a wood or iron club was used to beat their limbs. One variation of this was a wooden cross instead of a wheel that the person was strapped to, and then they were bludgeoned. The victim's body could remain on the wheel for display after they died, often their very slow and painful death. There was a record of a tortured Jew that had lasted 4 entire days before he finally died. If you were lucky, you could receive a merciful blow to the chest early and die quickly.
A man named Jean Calas of Toulouse, France, in 1762, had been tried for the murder of his son. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and after his sentencing, claiming that his son's death had been a suicide. Unable to convince the court of his innocence, he faced torture on the Catherine wheel. He did not, however, perish on the wheel. His arms and legs were, however, dislocated. But this man was spared that terrible death and granted a much more horrible one, as he also faced the iron chair.
So they took him from the Catherine wheel when he didn't die and put him in this new thing?
Or they kept him alive on the Catherine wheel specifically for the chair. I know what you're thinking. Like Game of Thrones, right? Well, you're on the right track, except picture hundreds of sharp spikes on the seat, back, arms, and legs of the chair. The convicted person was seated and held in place by a front bar on the chair, so like a high chair, and then another vertical bar. 2 rings fastened the ankles to the legs of the chair, and in the upper portion there was a collar for the neck, and then another transverse bar passing through the first, fitted at each extremity with a ring holding the wrists. So their arms were held to the arms of the chair, their legs were held to the legs of the chair, and their neck was strapped so they had to sit back against the back of the chair, and then obviously they got butt spikes because they're sitting on it. If that isn't torture enough, underneath the seat of the chair was a stove. The torturer would progressively tighten the restraints, forcing the spikes deep into the flesh of the victim. Weights would be placed on the victim's thighs or feet, and this torture could go on for hours and sometimes days. The good news was the spikes did not penetrate vital organs, so blood loss was minimal, at least while they were seated. The spikes would hold the wounds shut, but once they were removed from the chair, the victim was not long for this world. In case you care, 2 years after his execution, Mr. Callis was exonerated.
Do you like roasted chicken?
I love roasted chicken.
I'm a big fan. You tie your chicken up, place it in a nice cozy dish, and you throw it in the oven, letting the ambient heat slowly cook it to perfection. Well, our next torture device is kind of like that. If you watched the 2011 movie Red Riding Hood with Amanda Seyfried, you may have a little bit of a visual reference. We're talking about the brazen bull. One of the most brutal, yet strangely elegant methods of execution originated in ancient Greece and came in the form of elegantly sculpted bronze bull statues. However, they were actually as lethal as the man who invented them. Perillos of Athens, somewhere between years 570 and 554 BC.
Why a bull, cousin?
The Romans allowed the influence of the Greeks and used it to torture the Christians. The metallic animal was hollow on the inside with a door on the side of its body, through which a person could be placed into the belly of the beast. Once this victim was shut in the brazen bull, a fire would be lit under it, heating the device, essentially turning it into an oven, and roasting the victim within it.
Roast.
The most gruesome part of this, I think, is that it doubles as musical entertainment of the onlookers. As the heated metal seared the victim's flesh, he or she would scream in agony, the sounds of which channeled into small pipes of the nostrils, resulting in the bellowing sound being emitted from the bull. The nostrils were also said to be packed with incense to mask the smell of burning flesh, like seasoning your chicken with herbs. Just saying.
Since we're on the subject of food preparation, we might as well stay there. Get out your kitchen tools because it's time to talk about flaying. During the Middle Ages, it was frequently used to torture and execute captured soldiers, and of course, like always, witches. In one version of the flaying torture, the victims were tied to a pole, arms tied above their heads, and their feet were tied at the ankles with their body completely exposed, so they're naked. The torturer would use a small knife to slowly peel the victim's skin. In most cases, the peeling began with the face, slowly working down to the victim's feet. Most victims died before the torturer even reached their waist. Thank goodness. Another method for this type of torture, the victim was exposed to the sun until he had a horrific sunburn. As someone who's pigmentally challenged, I can sympathize. That's horrible. After the person was nice and sun-fried, the torturer began peeling off their sun-seared skin using the strategy that we just described. In yet another variation of this type of torture, a person would be submerged into boiling water first, taken out after a few minutes, and then slowly flayed. Man, these people were just like beyond depraved, weren't they?
I don't think I could have done any of this to anyone else, no matter what they've done.
So the burning and boiling weren't just added to the procedure to make the torture worse. As you can imagine, skinning an entire person is probably kind of difficult. So this was kind of a type of tenderization, so to speak. It made the skin easier to peel off.
I imagine after some practice, you got better. You know, like normal things.
Yeah, like skinning a deer.
Do it a couple
like
times.
Yeah.
You're good to go.
Okay, so think about the anatomy of the skin. The nerve endings that extend into the deep tissue layers of your skin. This is how we have sense of touch. This is why we respond to stimuli that causes pain. This response is caused by nociceptors, which are sensory nerve cells that respond to pain. In the process of having your skin ripped off, with your nerve endings not being severed cleanly, but rather torn to shreds one by one. You're going to feel every little bit of your skin as it is torn from your muscle, as your nerve endings die. This, my friends, really effing hurt. Also, you're gonna bleed a lot. No amount of the endorphins gifted to you by your brain is going to ease this. Your insulation from the elements is gone. You're going to feel the chills. You're going to get real cold. If you're lucky, you'll go numb eventually. If you're really lucky, you'll pass out. And lucky or not, you're eventually going to die. And actually, hypothermia was one of the bigger causes of death from this, because once you don't have your skin, you are not protected from the elements at all.
Do you remember the movie Pocahontas?
Well, I love that movie.
Mm-hmm. With that cute little raccoon and the pug. Do you remember the guy who brought the pug to Jamestown? John Ratcliffe? Well, this cartoon character, like a few others from that film, was loosely based on a real person. Ratcliffe was the commander of one of the 3 ships that sailed to Jamestown, the Discovery. He became counselor of the colony, but eventually fell out of favor with the colonials, many of whom disagreed with his handling of trade with the natives, as well as his management of the food shortages in 1608. In the year 1609, Ratcliffe and 14 fellow colonists were invited to a gathering with the tribe of the Powhatan Indians, who had promised corn to the starving colonists.
It's a trap!
It's a trap! The colonists were ambushed. Ratcliffe was tied to a stake. The skin from his entire body was removed using mussel shells.
Clams! They peeled him with clams!
The women who did the flaying tossed the pieces of flesh into a fire as he watched. They saved his face for last and then burned him at the stake. There's actually a documented eyewitness account of that. If you choose to, you can find more detail in, quote, The Jamestown Adventure. Accounts of the Virginia colony, 1605 to 1614. Look it up.
Definitely worth a Google.
That reminds me of an episode of Hannibal I just watched. Have you watched that?
No, I haven't watched that series.
There's a part where they end up sedating a guy and somehow he ends up using a knife and cutting off his own face and feeding it to the dogs while he's still alive. And it's, he's cutting off pieces of his face, his own face, because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's on drugs and he's just feeding it to dogs. And then he cuts off another piece and then he feeds it to the dogs. And oh my God, it scarred me. I can't watch that.
Yep, that sounds awful. In a dramatic turn, let's dive into something a little less fiery, like, I don't know, water. Being that water was a relatively easy source to come by, and it's dangerous and scary, it too was often utilized as a means of torture. In some cases, a person would be tied to a board, supported horizontally onto trestles. Using a horn as a funnel, the victim's nose would be pinched, forcing them to swallow. Slowly, about 9 pints of water would be funneled into their mouth. If their crimes were extraordinary, however, double that amount of water was poured in. There were no rules in this time to protect the treatment of prisoners who faced torture and punishment. These methods were seen as a legitimate means to extract confessions, obtain the names of accomplices, testimonies, or to impose penalty in the name of justice. And they were sanctioned by law. I'm not sure if you were aware of this, but while it is frowned upon, this specific method of torture has been used in relatively recent years, placing a cloth or a rag over a restrained person's mouth and dumping gallons on gallons of water onto said rag. Just throwing that out there.
The ducking stool, involving water, may not have appeared until Tudor times, though its use was widespread throughout England, Scotland, and colonial America by the 17th century, and it remained in use until the 19th century. This device was a chair which hung on the end of a free-moving arm which was placed by a river. A woman was strapped to the chair and could be ducked into the freezing cold water. The length of the immersion into the water was determined by the operator based on the crime she was accused of. Maybe a few seconds, or maybe it was continuously repeated over the course of an entire day. For the most part, this was seen as a punishment pretty much exclusive to women, to be punished for a range of minor offenses, like not behaving as a dutiful maid or wife was expected to, sometimes for prostitution and witchcraft. But often the sentence was for being a common scold. A scold was a term given to a gossip, a shrew, or a bad-tempered woman during the medieval era. A scold was defined as, quote, a troublesome and angry woman who is brawling and wrangling amongst her neighbors and breaks the public peace, increases the discord, and becoming a public nuisance to the neighborhood. Oh shit.
Oh shit. That's me.
Sam the spoon licker, licking the spoon she stirred the shit with.
Ew.
Mm-hmm.
Ew.
Yeah.
In cases of witchcraft, this method was seen as a foolproof way to establish whether a suspect was a witch. The stools were used at first, but later they were ducked without the chair, and instead a woman's right thumb would be tied to her left toe, and a rope was tied to her waist. The witch was then thrown into a deep river or a pond. If she floated, it meant that she was in league with the devil. We all float down here. If she drowned, she was considered innocent, while, like we said, this was a method of torture primarily reserved for the lady folk. Men accused of witchcraft would also be tested using this method.
Speaking of scolds, let's put a bridle on it. Literally. A scold's bridle was an iron muzzle with iron framework which encased the head of a woman for the purpose of torture and humiliation. The punishment or humiliation included a public display. She would be led through town or tied to the town cross. This was considered a firm reminder for how women are expected to behave. A husband could parade his wife in her scold's bridle mask around town. So we would get the idea that this torture device was intended mostly to stop the woman from talking. To ensure the success of that mission, a bit with spikes was put in her mouth on top of her tongue. The pain made it impossible to speak. There would be a chain attached to the sides of the mask so the woman could be led on a leash or tied up for someplace for a while. Verbal abuse, spitting, being beaten, having her head shaken, causing broken teeth or jaws, as well as blood and vomit were among the types of treatments a woman could expect while being paraded in her bridle.
It's less a bridle than a humiliation mask, but there is a scene in the Red Riding Hood movie where Amanda Seyfried's character is forced to wear a metal pig mask and put on public display, just for a pop culture reference. There's also a movie that I saw not too long ago where a woman was made to wear a scold's bridle to church. It was a Western type movie, but for the life of me, I cannot remember what it was called. Anyway, speaking publicly at all was considered to be an immodest act for women in those days. Outspoken or assertive women were a threat to authorities. Women had to be stopped from challenging priests and defying husbands. We would be in so much trouble. Also, apparently tongue ripping was also a thing, and it sounds exactly like it was, cutting or ripping a person's tongue out.
So, while we're on the subject of outspoken women, I feel like it's a good time to talk about Kepler's mom.
I know it
Kepler's
might
mom.
seem wrong, but I'm in love with Kepler's mom.
Anyway, the renowned astronomer Johannes Kepler's mother, Katharina Kepler, was accused of witchcraft in 1615 at the age of 68. According to an article in The Guardian, the wife of a glazier who suffered from a chronic illness accused the widow of poisoning her. Later, a 12-year-old girl accused Kepler of hitting her arm while walking past her. What a baby. She stated that the incident caused her pain, which continued to increase until the girl was unable to move even a finger on that arm. Other such accusations included that she was killing local animals and turning herself into a cat.
McGonagall, you got McGonagalled. For 14 months of her imprisonment, she was chained to the floor of a prison cell, subjected to the threat of torture, being shown instruments of torture, as well as speaking to her in a very threatening manner while trying to get her to confess. According to the Guardian article, her famous son took over her trial and managed to have her freed in 1621, but sadly, she died just 6 months after the trial ended.
One of the torture instruments she was forced to watch during her imprisonment were the thumbscrews. She was made to watch as they applied this method of torture to other prisoners. This device consisted of 3 upright metal bars. The thumbs were placed in between those bars. Another horizontal wooden or metal bar slid down along the metal bars and pressed the thumbs up against the bottom. Then a screw pressed the wood bar down with pressure, crushing the thumbs. This was a very insidious device, causing unbearable and immeasurable agony. You might walk away from this torture deformed and disabled, but the important part is you would walk away, albeit without your much-needed opposable thumbs, which come in handy for gripping things like bows and arrows, swords, and the reins of your horse.
And thumbs up. Ayy.
Yeah, you can't Fonz it anymore. It's not pretty.
Yeah. Of course, we can't not take this too far. We're humans. The thumbscrew was of course adapted to crush bigger things, like big toes. Larger screws were created for knees, elbows, and yes, heads. Obviously, the head screw or head crusher probably did end in the inevitable demise of the person being subjected to its use.
Or they were just lobotomized.
With a crush head?
Probably, I don't know. Let her roam. While this is far from all the torture devices and methods on our list, I think it's probably about all we're going to cover for today. So let's end this episode with 2 thumbs up. Ha, get it?
Wait, let's not.
Because thumb screws. Thank you for taking this journey through historical torture with us today. We hope listening wasn't torture. If you want to get a hold of us for any reason, you know the drill.
Drill.
Drill. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, and you can text us or leave us a voicemail at 641-812-2635.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
me, bro.